Race fans, it's time to buckle in and listen to the fastest hour in racing radio. Your driver is a multi-time NASCAR winner and Hall of Famer Mark Martin. We cover racing, grassroots, history, we bench race, we talk life, and most importantly, we smash the loud pedal. It's time to turn some laps on the Mark Martin Podcast.
Episode 24 of the Mark Martin Podcast, and we're going to get into the very first full year of NASCAR, 1982. But before we do that, make sure to head over to Mark Martin Pod, markmartinpod.com, and check out all of the old episodes. Also, make sure to hit us up on social media at Mark Martin Pod, Mark Martin Pod on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and now YouTube. Again, you can go to markmartinpod.com and get all of the listen links. Check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and of course, again, the new YouTube page. But Mark, the year 1982, a very transitional year for your racing career.
Yeah, you know, I left off on the last episode at Charlotte. You know, we were racing in 81 out of North Liberty, Indiana, up at Dillon's, and the last race on my schedule was Charlotte, Busch race, end of October, I think it was, late October. And we ran second, collected that $15,000 check, which was really one of my biggest paydays ever. Everything felt right. Everything looked good. So we just stayed. I ran the race, and after the race I stayed in Charlotte. Got an apartment. Started working on securing a shop, and started making plans to move my equipment and stuff down to the new shop right there at the Speedway at Charlotte. There was a few shops back there next to the Goodyear warehouse. And so my dad had been building a Mack box truck for me to use, and pull, you know, car on open trailer behind it. So that was going to be the new hauler. And I decided to hire someone from NASCAR, because I just had my little short track ASA guys, Banjo, and I guess David Lovendahl was still with me at that time, and so I was going to hire up a few Southern guys for the shop, build me a new Hutchinson Pagan Speedway car, and so I hired Bobby Jones to be my crew chief, and so Bobby was going to build this Speedway car the way he wanted it, so hang the body on it the way he wanted it, whatnot. Like I say, I didn't know a hell of a lot about, you know, I guess I had my head in my ass because I didn't pay close enough attention. He built the car at a 4-inch left front frame height, hung the body on it, the Daytona car. So I was going to start the season off with two cars, Speedway car and the car that I'd had, in 81, a real lightweight short track car. And so we get the car ready to go to Daytona. And of course I've got, I'm in the Busch Clash, and I've, made acquaintance with Dale Earnhardt, and Dale invites me up to the lake to his house to watch tapes of races. I got tapes of ASA races, and so I go over there. We go in his basement, get the VCR rolling, watch a few of my ASA races, and then he says, "Mark, I'm not in the Busch Clash this year, but let me show you, how to win that thing." And he plays the race from the year before, and he won it, and it was pretty cool. Dale Jr. comes walking downstairs, He's just a little bitty boy. Pretty amazing time in my life. It was pretty exciting to be sort of acquaintances with Dale Earnhardt and somebody who'd already won a Winston Cup championship. So anyway, we head down to Daytona with our speedway car, and we're going to run the Busch Clash. They invite me to come to some dinner, and so obviously I go because the Busch beer sponsors and all that stuff. So I went, and not many guys showed up. They hand me a check for $1,500. Man, I couldn't believe it. I remember it to this day, feeling like, golly, I've hit the jackpot here. All I had to do is come to this thing, and they give me that, and it's $10,000 to start the race. Man, this is just economics of this deal is just going to work out okay. So we take the car through, and I'm going to run the same car in the Busch Clash as in the 500, by the way. Same car. I've got Ron Neal prototype motors. I'm still kind of on the engine program with those guys. So that's, it just all seems like it's going to work out pretty good. I have in January, I signed a contract with Apache Stove, which is wood burning stoves, just up the road from Charlotte, China Grove. Signed a deal with them for $50,000 sponsorship. And so, I was feeling pretty good. I knew, the money would be a little tight, but I got 50 grand in cash and going to win a race here pretty soon. But I hadn't yet collected anything from them by the time I went to Daytona. So anyway, we roll the car through tech, and of course I'm right there with them because I'm always working on the car. And they take this block and they go to slide it under the left front of the car, and it misses by an inch. It's a 5-inch block, and they've got a rule that says you got to be 5 inches at the left front frame height. My car is built at 6 inches. My car's built at 4 inches. So we had to raise the car up an inch. So we had to run the car an inch high at Daytona. Well, if you've got any idea what that means, that a whole inch would, a quarter of an inch is a big ass deal, much less an inch. So we had to run speed weeks an inch high. So I didn't run good in the Busch Clash. And, but we make the race, no problem. But we don't run very good. Things are turning sour. And on Saturday night before the 500, Bobby stays out pretty much all night, stays out all night, doesn't show up to meet the crew in the morning. And Bobby, so I get to the racetrack, and you can imagine what the demeanor was of our team and all of us, because we were dejected. We weren't running worth a damn. We were broke. And our team, our leader, was missing in action. I'm more interested in partying than racing. So we get we take the car through tech, whatever, and do all the things we got to do to get her out there on the line. And of course, we don't run worth a damn in the race. And of course, I fire Bobby. And that's how our season started. We went home from there, and we went to the next few races and didn't run worth a damn. And that set the tone for the year. We were just, we never collected a dime from Apache Stove. They wound up going out of business. And we struggled every time we turned around. We had mechanical problems and wound up, running on a tight budget without the right stuff. A few of the highlights of the season was Darlington. We ran, I think we ran top 5 at Darlington on 7 cylinders. Ran on 7 cylinders over half the race. And I think we finished something like maybe 7th or 5th or 7th or something like that. And we had a really good run at Riverside. Had a hydraulic clutch in the car. The clutch broke, so the hydraulic clutch part of it broke. So I ran the full race with a T10 transmission 4-speed, shifting without the clutch. And on the green flag pit stop, I just come in and killed it, put it in first gear. And when they dropped the jack, started it, cranked it off in first gear and drove it off. And still, I think we run 5th, 6th, 7th, something like that. I thought it was 5th. We had a good run out there at Riverside, but we had a good run at Dover. My first time at Dover, we had a good run. But as the season went on, we was just broke in half. Darrell Waltrip begged me to drop back to a limited schedule, and I should have done it, but I was so stubborn and hard-headed that I was going to beat Jeff Bodine and win Rookie of the Year. I'd never lost, I'd never been beat. And, of course, Jeff was driving for Cliff Stewart, very well established, decently funded team, and, much older and more mature race car driver than me. And I just watched my career go down the tube in front of my eyes. It was a terribly tough year. Hutchison Pagan and Goodyear both let me get in debt to them. They let me charge. I had big bills by the end of the year on with both of them. And one of the highlights of the year was they were filming that movie Stroker Ace, and my dad, they were going to pay me, I swear I'm thinking 50 grand. That sounds like a lot. Maybe it was 15. It was either 15 or 50 grand, probably 50, to put a car in the movie. So my dad drove my car in the movie, in the filming of the movie, the O2 car. You'll see it if you watch the movie. And so that was a small source of income, but we were in deep trouble, just surviving, running mid-pack, terribly disappointed. So when the season was over, I had an auction. I decided that I wasn't going to be a car owner anymore, and I had an auction and sold everything that I had. And then I paid off Goodyear and paid off Hutchison Pagan, and I had a little bit of money left over, and I put that as a down payment on a house. And I still thought I was going to be okay in the sport. I thought, well, somebody will hire me to drive their car. And nothing happened in December. And finally in January, I got a call from Humpy Wheeler that said, asked if I had anything yet. And I said no. And he says, Jim Stacy's going to call you. Well, heck, about driving the 2 car. Well, the 2 car, Tim Richmond had drove in 82 and won a couple of races. It was a great car. Well-funded team, great car. Dale Inman was the crew chief. It was fantastic. So got the call finally from Jim. So I went to Kentucky to meet with him. And he said, well, yeah, get a contract together. And we'll do this thing. And I said, I don't need no contract. That's how damn dumb I was. And it was okay, cool. So we went to Daytona, and the car didn't handle well, and I wrecked it. And then we went a couple other races, didn't run really good. Then we went to Darlington, and we should have won Darlington, but we ran third because of pit call, in my opinion. By the way, Dale Inman didn't crew chief it. Booby Harrington did. Booby didn't think much of me, and I was learning to not think that much of him. He had been put on a tight budget. It wasn't anything like the kind of budget that he'd been on the year before. I guess Stacy was in one of his financial lulls. He was one of those guys that became a millionaire and then went broke over and over and over again. And we went to Atlanta, and we're running really good at Atlanta. And I know how many sets of tires we got, and we're having to use a lot of sets of tires. And I start coming on the radio and asking about tires, and they went and bought another set of tires, and they went and bought another set of tires. And I'm talking about we're running top 5. And on the last stop, they put a set of used tires on me, and we run 7th. We should have been top 5. And so we go to Martinsville, and we're running at Martinsville, and Earnhardt, I get on the inside of Earnhardt going down in turn 1, and Earnhardt cut me off, and I stayed there and tangled, and he and I both spun, and I got hit and jacked my car up, so we didn't finish good there. And the next race was Talladega, and I had to do winter circle for the team. So after Martinsville, I flew to Hueytown with Bobby Allison and stayed at Bobby's place because I had to do winter circle on Tuesday. So I'm hanging out with Bobby at his place, getting ready to do winter circle, and I get a call from Booby. We're letting you go. So I got fired because I wasn't smart enough to have a contract. So after that, kind of bounced around for a while. Morgan McClure, the 4-car, was out there in their early racing career. They had this old piece of junk Cutlass that was terrible. So they hired me to drive it. They were running a limited schedule. They hired me to drive it. And GC Spencer was a crew chief, and GC was certainly old schooler. And of course, I was a kid, and he and I didn't see eye to eye at all. He didn't understand anything about chassis setup stuff like I did. And he didn't think I was much of a driver, and I knew he had a piece of shit for a car. But they did purchase a AJ Foyt Super Speedway Hutchison Pagan car, and that was a really nice car, but it was only a Daytona Talladega car. And we ran real good at Talladega with that car, but that was the only time we ran goods with that car. That Cutlass was junk. At the end of the season, they didn't call me back, and I didn't call them back. Like, I didn't want to drive for them, and they didn't want me to drive for them. So,
So to be clear, though, we're talking about 1983. We moved from 1982, which it seems like, I mean, to this day, you seem very dejected by 1982, and you moved right over into 1983 and started talking about, looks like you did about 4 different teams in 1983.
yeah, I guess I tied those two together because I just didn't want to talk about 82. It was such a crushing year for me. And it really led into 83 in such a way. And I guess I should have stopped there, but 82 was the beginning of the end of my career. And 83 was kind of the nail in the coffin. I flew back in 83. I flew back to Wisconsin and raced short track art go shows for deal money to, pay my personal bills to make a living. And, so I'd fly back and forth trying to make my career work. But by the end of of '83, I wasn't interested in going forward with Morgan McClure, and they weren't interested in having me. Didn't even ask me about driving their car. So that kind of was a crushing end, and all of that kind of goes together. So going into '83, I didn't have anything left. I had sold everything that I had, started my career. Uh, everything that I had built up from the start of my career all the way to that point, we auctioned off. And so I'm sitting there thinking that, everything's going to work out for me in '83 and I'm going to get a ride. And I finally do, but it's not the ride I thought I was getting. And, they don't have any success. They fired me and put Morgan Shepherd in the car because they wanted someone with experience. Well, they didn't run any better. And, they finished off the year and then they closed their doors. And that was the kind of bad luck that I had. I thought I was getting in, Tim Richmond's car, and I knew I could win in that car if Tim Richmond could. And it wasn't the same program as it was in '82. So
you go from 1981, you are on the top of the mountain, feeling good. Your career is, on the upward swing. And then within the matter of 2 years, completely dejected by your experience in NASCAR in '82.
Yeah, with nothing. I got nothing but a van to drive for a vehicle. I've got nothing. Now at the end of it, in 2 years, I'll go from that $15,000 check at Charlotte running second in the Busch race and the thrill and excitement of moving and setting up shop. Exactly 2 years later, I got a van and nothing. No job, no racing, no cars, no nothing. And yeah, I'm really broken, emotionally broken person. I mean, it really did a number on me. I was young and had never experienced that kind of failure, and just couldn't believe that I'd seen that kind of change in my career over the course of 2 years.
So it would be 3 more years before you came back to NASCAR in 1986. We'll get to those years after this, but you had to go and rebuild everything. You had to start back from the bottom to get back to the top again. So just kind of give us an overview of that.
Yeah, well, I guess this podcast will be '82 and '83, and then this podcast will segue into '84, which will be the year that I start over again. I find a group that has a car in Wisconsin that will hire me to drive and work on the car. And so I round up a buddy of mine in Charlotte and make a deal with him that he can share an apartment with me in Beaver Dam and come to work for me for $100 a week. So he and I plan on making a move to Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, and start my short track racing career all over again. And on the way up there, I stopped through Arkansas for Christmas, which is where I meet Arlene Martin. So there's a lot of really good, interesting stuff going into the 1984 season. The story of meeting Arlene and courting Arlene and marrying her, and my stories of not having a deal with anybody, not being able to get free anything anymore when I used to not buy anything. And sort of a, my spirit spiraled downward. So there's a lot of information, a lot of information about to talk about for 1984.
So going back to 1982, you touched on the Apache sponsorship. Talk about the Jolly Rancher car.
So we did get a deal with Jolly Rancher. It was very, very small. $2,500 or something like that. They gave us a little bit of money here and there for a few races. We had hoped that if we did it for nearly nothing, that they would come on board, but we couldn't get them. We couldn't get them hooked. We also made a trip to Tyson Chicken, because Tyson Chicken was in Arkansas. Made a pitch to them. Didn't do any good there. And we made a trip up to Walmart, Bentonville, Arkansas, and thought, man, this is perfect. An Arkansas company, going big, and an Arkansas boy trying to make it big. And it was just an ideal, Walmart would have been an ideal program for it would have been good for me, good for them. It could have been the dream deal. And they said they just weren't interested in doing any charity, whatever. So, they didn't get it, didn't have any idea about marketing. I mean, they could have done what they did when they did get involved, which is it wouldn't have cost them a dime. All of their vendors could have paid for it. The products that they sold in in their stores had advertising budgets, and they could have, it could have been so great, but we just couldn't, we couldn't figure out how to get them interested in doing it. So, we didn't get much money in sponsorship for, peanuts. I'm talking peanuts is what we got for 1982.
So talk about, in 1983, you had 4 different cars. It's out of your hands for the first time in your career. You're not in charge. I mean, you had to feel just way different going into these scenarios, and it sounds like you had struggles with some of these crew chiefs and team members and things like that. It's just a completely different mindset for you.
It is, because I'd always prepared my own cars, and they were usually light years ahead of the competitions. And now I'm just showing up with a helmet and driving these pieces of junk, cars that are way inferior to anything that I would have ever prepared. And, I'd made the decision to be a helmet boy, bring my helmet and drive their stuff, but I hadn't made the decision to drive junk. I thought I would show up and drive good cars like guys I knew. I was friends with Tim Richmond in 1981, 82. I saw what he did. I saw these other great drivers. And those guys showed up and drove for teams that fielded respectable race cars. And that's what I thought, that's what I thought I was going to get to do in 1983. But that kind of opportunity never surfaced. I had to drive junk.
How does your experience in struggling like that, does that translate when you talk to some of these younger drivers in NASCAR today? Is it a completely different thing? I mean, you see it, some of these guys coming up and down the road trying to get onto these starting park teams and things like that. I mean, does any of that translate?
The starting park teams do. Those are very similar to, the kinds of cars that you hoped you might get to drive, back when I was getting started there. They ran the races. The difference is they park the cars, start and park now. Back then, they ran the races, but they ran them. They bought tires or got tires, used tires. In other words, Junior Johnson would put bolt-on stickers and run them for a run, take them off, and when they take them off, they'd roll those down to your pit, and the next pit stop, you'd put them on your car. And you ran, budget engine, not turned up engines, but, tuned down engines and high gears so the RPMs wouldn't be high. And you petted your stuff. And that wasn't all bad. There were some teams out there that ran, but they would run the whole race back then. So you got experience. You got a lot more experience. Things are different now and today. There were pressures back then. The pressures are different today. But there's still pressure. I mean, these young kids that come in today to drive, if they don't produce right now, because they get in top-notch equipment now, and they have to perform right now. Back then, you had a chance to get in back marker cars and run and learn and make mistakes without being in the spotlight. So there was a lot of pressure back then, but it was different than the pressures of today. Today is just a different day and age.
You said, going back to the last podcast, episode 23, that this struggle that you had in 82 and 83, you wouldn't trade anything for it. You dealt with it, you moved on, and then you came back. And obviously we know the rest of the story. But you said that this is an experience that you wouldn't trade in, that you wanted this experience, now looking at your whole career.
If I hadn't survived it, it wouldn't have been good. And it could have been one of those things that you didn't survive. But I did survive, and it made me a completely different person. It humbled the crap out of me. It shaped the person that I became 100%. And I'm pretty happy with the person that I became. And when I look back, I'm not that happy with the person that I was before this all come crashing down. So it was a very dramatic learning experience. It was something that I didn't deal with well, but I did deal with it, and I did manage to get through it, and I did come out on the other side, and I became a better person for what I had been through.
So let's go back to Darrell Waltrip mentioning that you should run a shorter season, and you didn't take his advice. Now, why didn't you? You said you're stubborn, but let's try to get into some detail why you didn't take his advice.
Because I wanted to win Rookie of the Year. I would never be able to run for Rookie of the Year again. And I wanted to win. I never had lost. And I wanted to beat Jeff Bodine and win Rookie of the Year. And the only way I was going to do that probably was run all the races. I guess I could have still won it running a limited schedule, but I didn't want to give up.
So yeah, at that point, you had the blinders on, and you were just so driven at that point. And you've been driven your entire career, but at this point, it was to the point of no return. You're just so focused on that you couldn't see anything.
Yeah, just to me, that would be giving up. And looking back on it, I had already lost, and I needed to drop back and try to overly prepare for each race like I did in 1981. In 81, I didn't have to race every week. So, I maxed out everything, prepared and was ready. And once you went broke and you were racing every single week all over the damn nation, and you were underfunded and understaffed and under equipment, you weren't ever going to perform. You couldn't perform like that. So Darrell could see that. Darrell was a good friend of mine. Darrell Waltrip was an amazing racer who he was a true, honest racer that came from short track racing and made it big in NASCAR, and he never forgot. He continued to race short tracks. And when I was racing ASA, Darrell would come every chance he got and come and run an ASA race. And he always did. He always raced short track races in and around the NASCAR races. So he knew who I was. He knew what I was, and he was a good friend of mine all through the years that even years and years and years after that. Darrell was always a good friend, and Darrell was right. He was right, and I just couldn't give up. I couldn't concede to defeat.
So, a little known fact: your first races in what would become a number synonymous with your career, the number 6, were also in 1983 in a number 6 Ulrich Racing car, which would eventually become Jasper Motorsports and things like that. But 2 races in the number 6 car in the Green Machine. Tell us about that quick.
Well, that would be what you would consider a start and park car today. And like I explained, you didn't park them back then. You ran economy style. You didn't put new tires on. You ran, you ran your engines low RPMs, detuned, and you did the things and you ran the whole races. And DK couldn't afford to pay me, but I wanted to race, so I did a deal with him for a couple races. And unfortunately, one of those races, I got in an accident at Nashville, and the other one at Talladega. Even though all the stuff was detuned, we ran pretty fast in the race, and it was a little too fast for his engine parts, and they broke. But we broke the 200 mile an hour barrier during the race before the engine let go. So DK, he ran the full schedule and ran it on a budget, and he just couldn't afford to pay me. I needed to get paid, and plus I needed to run on better equipment than that. If I'd have had a sponsor, I could have run, and he would upgrade his equipment if he'd have had the money, but he ran it on a budget. And that's when the 4-car came along, that looked like a little bit better program. And it was a growing program. The Cutlass they had was junk and outdated, but they were in a growing spell. They bought a really nice super speedway car. So they had a nice super speedway car, but there was only, a couple of races, restrictor plate races by the time I got there. And so, they were still in the building stages of, getting equipment and guys to work on their cars and stuff like that. And so it was just one step ahead of DK's car, not enough steps to be worthwhile.
So when you look back at this 1983 year and even after that, all of these teams do you realize after all this time that these guys really didn't have to take you on? I mean, you just kind of got what you got, and maybe it wasn't the best thing, but now after the fact, you've seen it, you learned it, and now you maybe kind of appreciate that?
Well, I just, my head wasn't in the best place. And, where Morgan McClure's concerned, if I would have had confidence, I could have sat down with them and told them what they needed to do, and they would have done it. They didn't listen to drivers back then. But if I would have thought that they would have let me have input in the direction of the team, I might have stayed. Well, they won the Daytona 500 later, many years later, they won it probably multiple times. I think Sterling and Ernie both won it in their car. They won races. They became a strong team years later.
But they also did that because of their experience with you.
Well, I wouldn't say because of my experience, but that was part of their experience, and it certainly took them a few years to get their program on track. And I didn't have any confidence that I was going to have input in that. When I was there, G.C. Spencer was a crew chief, and they weren't going to have that kind of success with G.C. Spencer. I'm sorry. I have lots of respect for G.C. Spencer, but it would be like hiring me to be a crew chief today. It's too late. I'm outdated, and G.C. Spencer did great things in the sport, and I have tremendous respect for him, but he wasn't up to date with where the sport was in 1983. And unfortunately, that's why you don't see any, you have to stay up with the times. And at some point in time, when you hit 70 or 80 years old, no matter how good you were at one time, there's too much, things change too much for you to be as good that far into your career as it was in your heyday. Same thing goes with drivers. I mean, same thing goes for crew chiefs or drivers, either one. You can't, it's just, you can't do it.
So 1982, 1983 covered here on episode 24 of the podcast. Next podcast, Mark, we're going to get into 1984. We're going to start rebuilding your career as you, basically hit the restart button. Back to short track racing. We're going to get into that for actually a couple years, and then we'll get back into NASCAR as some good breaks came later, a couple years later. Mark, any other closing things on 82 and 83 before we put a close to this one?
No, that's enough wallowing in that misery. I actually sort of enjoy moving forward from there. One of the toughest years of my career is coming up next. However, it's, I have great pride in that comeback, that beginning of a comeback. Now, it's not a comeback by any means. We don't have, overwhelming success, but we do have some success, and we come from rubble to get a couple of big wins.
So just one last thing on this episode. 1982, you ran a number 37. What was the reason for that? Their
driver didn't drive. They were in that race at Rockingham. It was a Rockingham race, and it rained out or something and got postponed, and their regular driver couldn't drive because it got postponed on something that conflicted, so I filled in for it. Just so happened that the crew chief for that car was Larry McReynolds. And one of the highlights of the 1982 season for me was that a third of the way through the season, I managed to get Larry McReynolds to come to work for me and be my crew chief. And I had the opportunity to work with him for the rest of that year as crew chief. And Larry was an awful lot of fun. He was a good kid. We had limited success because we had limited resources, but it was really good times.
So we're going to get into 1984 in episode 25, but we have wrapped up. We actually hit 2 years, 1982 and 1983 in this episode. But again, make sure to hit us up on markmartinpod.com. Watch listen to all the old episodes. And make sure to hit us up on @MarkMartinPOD on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thank you for subscribing and listening to the Mark Martin Podcast. Remember to give us a 5-star rating in your app store. Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @MarkMartinPOD. The Mark Martin Podcast is a production of the Accelerated Podcast Network.